Before we begin, leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact minute your clock shows when these words reach you. Every story begins at a point on the map and a point in time, and some refuse to stay buried in either. The year was 1857. The air in Natchez, Mississippi, carried that thick sweetness of river mud and magnolia, and the sky had the particular brightness that comes just before a summer storm breaks. Inside the parlor of Belmont Estate, a gathering of men sat waiting for a signature. The curtains were drawn against the glare, the air heavy with perfume and suspicion. On a walnut table lay the final page of a will, a single sheet that would set fire to every rule the South held sacred. The master of the estate, Robert Thornton, sat upright despite the fever that had hollowed his cheeks. He was 56, a man carved by discipline and drought, a planter of 3 generations standing, whose fortune in cotton and human labor stretched across 2 counties. His wife, Margaret, pale and rigid as the portrait above the mantel, sat beside him, gloved hands clenched in her lap. A clerk waited with a pen poised. Thornton's voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "Read it again." The clerk obeyed, words echoing like the tolling of a bell. "To my wife, Margaret Ann Thornton, and to my lawful heirs, I leave $1 each in acknowledgment of their place in my life. To Eliza, herein recorded as property, I grant manumission and the entirety of my estate, real and liquid, including the lands known as North Tract, the house, the livestock, and the sum of $52,000 to be held in trust for her and her 3 children, James, Henry, and Clara, whom I acknowledge as mine." There was no sound for a long moment, only the tick of the tall clock and the faint groan of wood as the storm outside gathered its first breath. Then the clerk cleared his throat and asked, almost whispering, "Do you wish to proceed, sir?" Thornton nodded once. The pen scratched. The witnesses signed. The thunder rolled. Outside, servants paused in the yard, sensing something shift that they could not yet name. The document was sealed at precisely 3:17 inches the afternoon. Within 6 days, Robert Thornton would be dead. No one was supposed to know the truth of what followed. Not really. The records were altered, names misspelled, and pages torn from ledgers, but some details remained enough to tell a story that the law itself tried to erase. Because what Thornton did that day was more than scandal, it was heresy. To grant freedom and fortune to a woman once enslaved and to leave his blood wife with nothing was to set himself against the entire architecture of his world. The will survived only because one witness, a junior attorney named Whitfield, copied it by hand before the original was confiscated during probate. His notation in the margin, "He signed with clarity of mind, though in fever," became the phrase that would haunt every argument that came after. The following morning, rumors ran through Natchez like lightning down a dry riverbed. The courthouse steps buzzed with half-heard accounts. That the old man had gone mad, that witchcraft had been involved, and that a northern abolitionist preacher had poisoned his thoughts. Margaret refused visitors. The estate gates were shut, and somewhere in the servants' quarters, Eliza, the woman whose name now stood where no name of color had ever stood on a legal instrument of ownership, was told what the paper meant. One record notes she wept. Another, from a neighbor's diary, claims she simply stood very still, staring out the window until the first drops of rain struck the sill. That storm broke fully by dusk. Lightning split the pecan grove in 2, setting fire to a dead limb that burned through the night. When it was over, the air smelled of ash and iron. The overseer swore he saw Mr. Thornton on the veranda at midnight, coat unbuttoned, face turned toward the fields, as if still surveying his dominion. The next morning his body was found in bed, hands folded neatly across his chest, with no sign of struggle. A physician certified death by heart failure. The papers called it natural. Others whispered that some debts can't be settled in coin. In the week that followed, the will entered probate. The widow contested immediately. She claimed her husband was delirious and manipulated by an immoral attachment, that the signature was forged and the witnesses bribed. The case file, which still exists in fragments, lists the estate at over $200,000, one of the largest in the county. The court clerk, perhaps out of prudence, recorded the inventory separately: land parcels, livestock, silver, and the names of 97 enslaved persons, each appraised with mechanical precision. Line 78 reads, Eliza, female, age 34, $1,200. Next to it, in different ink, appears a single word: freed. It's a port. That contradiction, one word that negated the rest, became the hinge on which everything turned. The widow's counsel argued that freedom voided inheritance. A person once listed as property could not own property. Eliza's advocate, a free man of color from New Orleans named Samuel Dorsey, countered that the manumission and bequest were simultaneous and inseparable in intention and execution. In the space between those arguments lay the question that still echoes: what is ownership when the ledger itself changes meaning? There is a letter, dated July 12, 1857, from Dorsey to an associate in New Orleans. "I fear the weight of custom will crush her before the law can raise its head," he writes. "Yet I have seen in her a calm that unsettles even her enemies. She speaks little, but when she does, it is with the gravity of one who has already measured the cost." By the time autumn came, the case had become a spectacle. Reporters from Vicksburg and Baton Rouge crowded the courthouse. Pamphlets were printed denouncing the contagion of Northern doctrines and the moral decay of our planter class. The story of the master who gave his fortune to a slave traveled farther than the cotton his fields had ever yielded. And through it all, Eliza remained invisible in the record, present only in third-hand accounts, always observed, never speaking in her own words. The silence around her was deliberate, an act of containment by those who could not comprehend that silence as power. What was it in Robert Thornton's mind that turned so completely against his world? Was it love, guilt, redemption, or a final act of rebellion? The documents give only fragments: a page from a physician's log noting sleeplessness, a canceled order for new field equipment, and a receipt for imported ink the same shade used in his will. None explain the conversion, only that it came suddenly and left devastation behind. By the winter of 1858, the estate's great house stood half empty. The widow had moved to town, her letters bitter with talk of betrayal. The fields lay fallow, and Eliza, still waiting on the court's decision, lived in a legal limbo, neither property nor proprietor, free in theory but watched by armed men who refused her entry into the house that was now, by law if not by practice, hers. In the courthouse vault there remains a faint imprint of Thornton's seal on the copy of the will. The wax is cracked, the paper yellowed, but the impression of a hawk clutching a key still holds its shape. Some stories start with that key, others end there. The question is which kind this will be. The courthouse in Natchez still stands, though the documents that passed through its rooms were never meant to survive this long. On the upper floor, sunlight filters through warped glass, striking the iron railing in bands that shift with the river's reflection outside. A century and a half ago, these same beams would have fallen across the oak table where the case of Thornton v. Thornton et al. Began its long descent into silence. It was July of 1857, the air too thick to breathe, the ceiling fans turning slow and uneven. The town clerk, Isaac Wilcox, described the crowd as half curious, half scandalized, with planters pressed shoulder to shoulder beside free men of color who stood at the back, hats in hand, silent witnesses to what none dared predict. It was a hearing disguised as an execution. Every element of Southern order depended on predictability of birth, inheritance, ownership, and hierarchy, and this case had shattered all of them in a single stroke of ink. The widow entered first, veiled in black despite the heat. Behind her came two sons, one 19, the other barely 16, both with their father's sharp jawline but their mother's pale, calculating eyes. Across the aisle sat Eliza, dressed plainly in a gray cotton dress, her hair bound, her posture straight. Between them, on the clerk's desk, lay the sealed copy of the will. The entire weight of the social order rested on whether that document was genuine. The argument opened with the familiar theater of law. Margaret's counsel rose, speaking in the measured cadence of a man who understood both his audience and his danger. He claimed delusion, manipulation, and unnatural affections. He read excerpts from plantation ledgers, letters, and medical notes, each chosen to paint the deceased as a man who had lost his reason under fever and female influence. His words, contamination, seduction, and aberration, hung in the still air like gnats. Each phrase was designed to restore the old order by shaming the anomaly back into silence. Dorsey, representing Eliza, waited until the afternoon light had dimmed before standing. His voice was low and careful, more teacher than preacher. He began not with sentiment, but with arithmetic. He read the will clause by clause, confirming its signatures, its witnesses, and its notarization. Then he asked that a single line from the probate inventory be entered into evidence, the one that listed Eliza's name twice, once as property, once as heir. This, he said, is the hinge of the matter. If a man can own another person, surely he can choose to release that ownership. And if he can release it, then he can acknowledge that person's humanity. The court must decide whether it will recognize the humanity its own laws already presume to regulate. Outside, thunder gathered over the river. Inside, no one breathed. The judge, a man named Foster, with gray whiskers and a habit of pinching the bridge of his nose when troubled, stared at the page before him for a long moment before declaring the hearing adjourned. The storm broke as the crowd spilled into the street. The widow was helped into her carriage. Eliza left on foot, escorted by Dorsey, neither speaking, the witnesses scattered. By dawn, the whole of Natchez knew the shape of the scandal, but none of its truth. To understand what happened next, you have to see how fragile the concept of ownership was, even at its most absolute. Every ledger, every transaction, was a fiction made stable by fear and routine. When a master died, the estate was not simply divided. It was measured, weighed, and reclassified. Enslaved families were broken and rearranged like furniture. Paper controlled memory. To alter that paper was to alter reality itself. Thornton's will did exactly that. It rewrote one name, then dared to preserve the ink. In an attic above the old records room lies a packet of correspondence labeled Estate of R. Thornton, Miscellaneous. Most of it is mundane bills of sale, crop reports, and receipts for lumber. But one letter stands out, written by the family physician, Dr. Hollis. Dated May 18, 1850 even, it reads, "The fever has not yet taken his mind, though it has made him reflective. He asks strange questions about the soul and its ownership. He speaks often of balance, of ledgers that do not close. He says he feels watched, not by the living, but by those who once worked his fields." The letter was never sent. It was found folded inside Hollis's medical ledger years later, the ink blurred where moisture had seeped in. Eliza's absence from most public records is deliberate. The newspapers referred to her only as the woman in question. The census of 1860 lists her as free, mixed, residing in the Northern District. Occupation, none. But an unsigned entry in the diary of Reverend Caleb Woodworth, a local pastor known for ministering to both white and black congregants, mentions a quiet woman of uncommon bearing attending Sunday service in late July of 1857, accompanied by 3 children whose likeness to their late master could not be denied. The entry ends with the line, "She sat at the back, but all eyes were upon her." The widow's campaign to reclaim the estate grew desperate. Witnesses were bribed. A second will, crudely forged, appeared and was quickly discredited. The sheriff reported vandalism at the North Tract, fences cut, livestock poisoned, and a cross burned into the barn door. Yet the local paper printed none of it. The Thornton name still carried weight, and public appetite for scandal was balanced by fear of what it revealed. Late that autumn, Dorsey filed a petition for injunction, arguing that the estate's revenues from cotton, corn, and rental income were being unlawfully seized by the widow's agents while the case remained unresolved. The ledger attached to the petition survives in remarkable detail. Each entry records bales shipped downriver to New Orleans, payments collected, and expenditures noted. At the bottom of each page, in Dorsey's handwriting, appears the same line: held in trust for E.T. The repetition is hypnotic, like a prayer or a curse. By the close of 1857, the courthouse docket listed Thornton's case as pending further testimony. In December, Dorsey traveled north to procure affidavits from the two witnesses who had signed the will, men who had since moved to Memphis to avoid the backlash. Their statements, notarized in Tennessee, confirmed Thornton's intent beyond question. Yet upon Dorsey's return, he found the Natchez courthouse sealed for fumigation after an alleged outbreak of fever. When it reopened, the Memphis affidavits were missing. The clerk's logbook for that week is blank. That gap in the record remains the black heart of the story. What happened to those papers is unknown. Whether they were destroyed by accident or erased by design, no one can say. But their disappearance ensured the case would never reach final judgment in Thornton's lifetime. It entered the Southern Archive as so many uncomfortable truths did, in pieces, scattered, half-legible, stubbornly surviving where no one meant them to. Margaret left for New Orleans in early 1858. The town chronicler notes her departure without ceremony. "The widow of Belmont has withdrawn," he wrote. "Her house is shuttered, her servants dismissed. The plantation fields were leased to another family under a temporary deed. Eliza remained on the North Tract, living in the overseer's cottage, surrounded by the very land that refused to acknowledge her title. Her eldest boy, James, worked the cotton rows beside men who had once called her by a name she no longer answered to. There's an old story told in the region that one night, during the last harvest before the war, lights were seen in the windows of the great house, though no one lived there. The next morning, footprints were found on the bare porch, small, leading to the locked front door, then vanishing. No one claimed to know who they were. If you stand in that yard today, you can still see the outlines where the main house stood before the fire of 1892. The ground swells gently, as if the earth remembers the shape of walls that once stood there. And if you listen closely when the wind moves through the pines, you might hear the low rattle of shutters that haven't hung in a century. A sound like paper, like the turning of a page. The story might have ended quietly there, just another dispute entombed in courthouse dust, if not for a single box discovered almost 80 years later. In the spring of 1935, during a renovation of the old Chancery building, a carpenter pried up a section of warped flooring and found a compartment lined with tin. Inside were 12 documents bound with waxed twine and a small linen pouch containing a brass key. The papers were fragile but legible. Drafts, letters, and notes in several hands, all dated between May and October of 1857. No one knows who hid them, but their contents redrew the case in startling detail. The first letter, unsigned, is addressed to M. Thornton, widow. The ink is dark brown, iron gall, and the handwriting confident. Madam, the instrument they call your husband's will was written not in his own hand, but dictated under influence. The woman he favored held sway unnatural to her station. She will bring ruin to the name you bear. There are ways to remove such an infection quietly. I can arrange it. You need only affirm your consent. No signature follows, only the initial W. The handwriting, when compared to later samples, matches that of a plantation manager named Whitcomb, dismissed from Belmont a month before the master's death for reasons unrecorded. The second letter is more disturbing. Written by Dorsey to a colleague in New Orleans, it describes a night visit to the estate following threats made against Eliza's children. "She will not leave the grounds," he wrote. "She says the land itself is her proof, and she will not abandon it, though she sleeps with a rifle by the door. I believe her. I have advised her to send the younger one south to my sister until matters settle." She answered, "They will not burn what he left me. They will have to come through me first." In another letter, undated but filed with the rest, Dorsey recounts a conversation with a county deputy sympathetic to the widow's cause. "He told me plainly that the lady had offered a bounty for the return of certain papers, the Memphis testimonies. I asked what she meant by return. He said, 'She means silence, sir.' Each page adds a thread, and together they weave a portrait not of melodrama, but of siege. The widow's camp sought to erase, Eliza's to endure. The courtroom became only one of many battlefields." A note scribbled by the young clerk Wilcox and found among the papers adds another layer. "I fear the widow will have her way." The judge confided that his own brother owes her family dearly. The docket is to be rearranged. Some matters are to vanish. The handwriting trembles, the last words underlined twice. Beneath them, faintly penciled, appears a single line. There is justice in ink, but they mean to dry it. For decades, those hidden pages would rest undisturbed, unknown to historians. But in the mid-60s, a graduate student from Jackson studying local emancipation records stumbled upon a reference to the Thornton anomaly in a footnote of a regional legal digest. She followed it to the courthouse and uncovered the tin box now cataloged as Private File 223. Thornton Estate, recovered, fragment. Her name, recorded in the accession log, was Mary Ann Peters. Her notes, written in neat cursive on yellow paper, reveal the dawning realization of what she'd found. "This is not merely a will," she wrote, "but a confession and a map. The language of the documents implies deliberate inversion. He meant to unwrite the world that made him." The box also contained a folded page torn from what appears to be Thornton's personal ledger. Most of it lists expenditures like bolts of cloth and barrels of salt pork, but at the bottom, under Notes Owed, appears a single sentence in his hand. "To Eliza, in payment of what cannot be paid." The date, June 9, 1857, coincides with his final illness. When you line the fragments side by side, the doctor's note, the hidden letters, the erased docket, you begin to see the faint outline of something larger than one man's defiance. It was a controlled implosion, a man trying to detonate the machine he'd helped build by weaponizing its own paperwork. He used the tools of ownership to annihilate ownership itself. But such revolutions rarely survive transcription. The system adapted. Margaret's lawyers delayed until delay became denial. By 1859, war loomed, and the courts turned to more urgent matters. In April of 1860, Judge Foster finally issued a ruling recorded only in summary form. "Will not enforceable in total. Property reverts to lawful heirs with exception of personal liberty, granted to named subject." The translation was cruelly precise. Eliza was free, but she owned nothing. The North Tract passed back into Thornton hands. The widow returned long enough to oversee the auction of furniture and equipment. A bill of sale lists the silverware, the rugs, and 2 mirrors described as tarnished beyond value. The great house stood empty through the war, its windows boarded, its fields stripped. Eliza's trail after that narrows, but does not vanish. Census records of 1870 list an E. Thornton residing in Natchez. Occupation, teacher. Age, 47, with 3 dependents. Local oral histories mention a small school for freed children operating from a converted carriage house behind the ruins of Belmont. One elder interviewed in the 30s recalled her as a quiet woman with a scar on her wrist and eyes that could stop a man from lying. The last confirmed document is a deed dated 1872, transferring ownership of a 2-acre parcel on the Old North Tract to the Colored Education Society of Adams County, signed by Eliza Thornton with a trembling hand. Beneath her signature appears a faint mark, what archivists call a witness flourish, identical to the symbol pressed into Thornton's original seal, a hawk clutching a key. From that point forward, her name disappears again. No death record, no grave marker, only that deed and a brief mention in the Natchez Democrat of a colored woman once associated with the Thornton family, deceased at an advanced age, respected by her neighbors. When researcher Mary Ann Peters first read that line, She wrote in the margin, "The world erased her twice, once in law, once in memory." She submitted her thesis in 1968 and died a decade later, leaving her research notes to the state archives. Her final entry reads, "The ink of the oppressed outlasts the paper of their masters." The deeper you go into the record, the more it feels like descending into a mine where light behaves differently. Every document glimmers, then fades, and you have to move cautiously, feeling for the next trace of truth before the dark closes in. What began as a legal dispute between a widow and a freedwoman becomes something elemental, a reckoning with ownership itself, with who gets to decide the weight of a life and the value of a name. And yet, one question remains unanswered. Why did Thornton do it? The letters describe a fever, yes, but not delirium. The man's notes show deliberation. Somewhere in those missing affidavits, in the erased docket line, there may have been an explanation, some private revelation that turned a master into his own heretic. Or perhaps the answer was simpler. Perhaps the ledgers he kept for decades finally became mirrors. Outside, the storm that began this story has long passed, but the air still feels charged, like paper before a spark. Because somewhere in the dust of that courthouse lies a single sentence that changed meaning when read aloud by the wrong voice. "To Eliza, I grant manumission and the entirety of my estate." Those words, once spoken, could never be unsaid. It is said that every archive has its pulse, that faint vibration in the paper when you touch something that once decided a person's fate. By the time the Thornton material reached the state collection in Jackson, that pulse had already outlasted 3 custodians and a fire. The papers were cataloged under Exceptional Emancipation Private Estates, 1850, 1860. They sat undisturbed until 2014, when a young archivist named Daniel Ricks began digitizing manumission files for a public history project. Ricks was meticulous and curious to a fault. What caught his eye was not the will itself, but the recurrence of a seal impression, a hawk and key, appearing across unrelated ledgers spanning 4 counties. Each seal was accompanied by a marginal note in various clerk hands. See Thornton file, per RT. Precedent, by special order. None explained what authority that precedent carried, but the frequency suggested a quiet contagion of defiance. It seemed that after Thornton's death, other planters or perhaps sympathetic clerks had invoked his case as precedent to register partial freedoms, apprenticeships, or informal trusts benefiting people who could not legally inherit. In the legal imagination of the South, the Thornton file had become an invisible loophole, a moral infection that bureaucrats tried to quarantine but couldn't kill. Ricks traced 27 such anomalies between 1858 and 1861, each stamped with a crude variation of the hawk and key symbol. Some freed a single individual. Others allocated property in care of an unnamed custodian. The language varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. The story that the courts had buried had found ways to replicate through the very machinery meant to suppress it. The deeper he went, the stranger, the coincidences grew. One ledger from neighboring Jefferson County listed an overseer's confession written just before the war. "We were told to burn what he left behind, but I couldn't. She stood there watching me, calm as the angel on Judgment Day. I saw something in her eyes that said the fire would take me too." The overseer signed only his initials, J.W. His handwriting matched that of the letter to Margaret found decades earlier, the one offering to remove the infection. If true, it meant Whitcomb had not vanished but fled, later dying in obscurity with guilt still on his hands. Ricks began assembling his findings into a dossier titled Echoes of the Thornton Bequest. His supervisor advised caution. The deeper his project went, the more resistance he met. Certain county offices declined to release materials. Others claimed floods had destroyed records that the archivist had already seen cited in 19th century correspondence. One anonymous email arrived in his inbox. "Let the dead rest. You don't know who still owns what." By then, the story had become an obsession. The Ricks traveled to Natchez that autumn, visiting what remained of the Belmont site. The property was privately owned by a timber company, but the original foundations were visible beneath the pine needles. A faint outline of a house, the ghost geometry of a vanished world. He found a fragment of ceramic tile glazed with blue floral patterning, likely from the main hall. Beneath it lay a half-buried metal fixture shaped like a key shaft broken in two. He photographed everything. That night, he stayed in a roadside motel outside of town. The rain came hard, the same relentless southern percussion that seems to keep time for the ghosts of the past. He wrote in his notebook, "Every act of record-keeping is an act of resurrection. We choose who returns by choosing which files to open." A month later, his digital uploads went live. Within weeks, messages poured in from genealogists and historians who recognized names of ancestors whose stories had been half told. One message stood out. It came from a retired teacher named Grace Hammond, age 79, who claimed descent from a freedwoman named Eliza, who taught letters near Natchez after the war. Attached was a photograph taken around 1880, a woman seated on a porch, eyes steady, 3 children clustered beside her, and faintly visible at her collar, a small brooch in the shape of a bird clutching a key. Ricks requested permission to examine the brooch, but Hammond replied that it had been stolen decades earlier during a house break-in. The only remnant was the photograph. Still, its existence confirmed a continuity long doubted by historians, that Eliza had indeed established a school and that the hawk and key symbol had been passed down as a quiet inheritance. By winter, Ricks's findings reached academic circles. A law review essay titled "The Thornton Precedent: Property, Personhood, and the Subversion of the Ledger" argued that the case represented the earliest documented instance of a Southern master weaponizing testamentary law to dismantle enslavement from within. The paper cited Thornton's own marginalia to Eliza in payment of what cannot be paid as evidence of deliberate moral intent rather than madness. Predictably, backlash followed. Some historians accused Ricks of romanticizing an anomaly, of reading rebellion where there was only indulgence. Others claimed the will was apocryphal, forged by abolitionists. The debate reignited the very tensions the case had once embodied: ownership of truth, authority of record, and legitimacy of empathy. The ethics grew thornier still when local property developers, noting increased media interest, claimed rights to the Belmont site and petitioned for excavation. The first dig, conducted in 2016, unearthed a section of charred masonry and 2 rusted hinges believed to belong to the house's cellar door. Among the debris was a fragment of parchment bearing half a sentence in faded brown ink. "The ledger of mercy is never balanced." Lab analysis later confirmed the handwriting matched samples from Thornton's known documents. Reporters asked Ricks what the phrase meant. He paused, then answered, "It means he understood the math. Some debts don't cancel out, they echo." The quote appeared in print the next day, but the nuance vanished. Headlines reduced it to sensational shorthand. "Master-turned-abolitionist lost will found." The town of Natchez revived the story for tourism. Plaques were proposed. Local descendants of both the Thornton and Hammond lines met for a symbolic reconciliation photo, smiling awkwardly before the ruins. Beneath that surface civility, the questions remained raw. Whose legacy was this now? The man who wrote the will, or the woman who survived it? That tension became the quiet heart of Ricks's documentary work. In one recorded interview, Grace Hammond recalls visiting the courthouse as a girl and running her fingers over the cracked seal of the copied will. "It felt alive," she said, like the wax still remembered the heat of his hand. Late in the footage, Ricks asks her what she thinks drove Thornton to such an act. She answers without hesitation. "He finally saw the difference between keeping and belonging." That sentence closes the first act of the documentary, but on paper, it opens the real question. When truth survives only in fragments, who completes the story, the one who wrote the words, or the one who kept living them? If you were to hold the recovered parchment today, The ink would look almost red in certain light, like diluted blood. The fibers tremble faintly with each breath you take near it. Archivists call it foxing. Others might call it memory. And as with all Southern ghosts, what matters is not that they haunt, but what they refuse to forget. The ledger of mercy is never balanced. It merely waits for the next hand brave enough to turn the page. They said she was a small woman, thin from years of careful eating, and that her voice could quiet a room of children without a raised tone. The freedmen who came to learn letters under her porch called her Miss Ellie. The record calls her E. Thornton, a name that still confuses genealogists. Part tribute, part irony. By 1871, the war was over, but peace had no grammar yet. The towns and fields were rearranged versions of their former selves. Men who once kept ledgers now kept ledgers for the Bureau of Freedmen, and women who had been property became subjects of files marked Case Resolved. Her school stood in what remained of the North Tract carriage house. The boards still carried the smoke scent of the fire that had eaten the big house. Children sat on rough benches, copying alphabets on slate, while she spoke about the weight of words. In one recollection, written years later by a student named Isaiah Bell, he described how she'd draw the letter O and say, "That's how the world circles back. That's how truth waits for its turn." He remembered her teaching by candlelight when rain made the roof leak, the shadows moving like ghosts of all that had burned. At night, she wrote in a ledger of her own. It was a plain book bound in brown paper, its entries alternating between scripture and arithmetic. On one page she had written, "If they name you, learn to write your name back." That book would later be found among the effects of a student who became a minister. Its pages are now too fragile to handle. Each line is written with the deliberate hand of someone who has made peace with patience. Those who lived near her spoke of her generosity, her silence, and her unyielding discipline. One woman, a laundress named Rebecca, remembered visiting the school in winter and finding Eliza kneeling before the hearth, repairing a child's torn shoe. When Rebecca remarked that such labor was beneath her new station, Eliza answered, "Nothing is beneath a soul that was once beneath everything." That remark, preserved in an oral account from the Works Progress Administration in the 30s, would later become the epigraph of a museum display about freed people's education. But in its time, it was only one more sentence spoken into humid air that remembered too much. The human cost of her inheritance came not from poverty but from vigilance. Her freedom was legal but never safe. Men came at night, sometimes with torches, sometimes only with words. The stories say she kept a musket behind the door but never fired it. One boy recalled hearing her pray aloud when threats drew near, not for protection but for restraint. She said anger was another chain, and she'd worn enough of those. By 1874, her sons were grown. James worked river freight. Henry kept books for a mercantile. Clara married a stonemason. All could read and write. The deed to the small parcel of land, her last possession, was transferred to the Education Society that same year. She remained in the cottage until her death, sometime in the late 1870s. The doctor's note lists pneumonia. The neighbors buried her at dawn in an unmarked grave near the grove where the hawk seal had once been pressed into wax. Her death went unremarked by the local press, but her students continued the school until the 1890s, teaching from the same benches and the same ledger of names and sums. One of those benches, scarred and split, now sits in a museum case labeled simply Freed School, Adams County. The placard doesn't mention her name. A century later, the children of those students would walk into new schools with linoleum floors and electric lights. None of them would know that the alphabet they recited had once been written on slates cut from a ruined carriage house under the eye of a woman who had inherited a plantation and could not live in it. But in small ways, her mark endured. Church registers record an unusual symbol beside the names of pupils who completed all 3 years of instruction. A bird, its wings folded, drawn in a single stroke. In 2017, when archivist Ricks visited the Natchez Museum, he asked to see that bench. The wood was soft and warm, from years of preservation light. Beneath one leg, carved faintly into the grain, was a series of initials, E, T, then 3 more letters, J, H, and C. The letters had been worn by time until they read like the outline of wings. He stood for a long time before the case. Later, in his notebook, he wrote, "What she built wasn't a school, it was a corrective." That line closes his field report. But the deeper meaning lingers. Every document, every object tied to her life, carries this strange inverted geometry. A plantation turned into a classroom, a will meant to divide turned into an inheritance of learning, and a signature meant to erase, transformed into proof of endurance. When you trace the arc of those years, you start to see mirrored shapes. The master balancing ledgers before death, the freedwoman balancing equations after, and the child learning to write his name as if closing a circle left open in another century. It's all accounting, but in the oldest, truest sense of the word. To make an account, to testify. In the back of the same museum, there's a faint wall text taken from Eliza's ledger, nearly illegible now. Curators reconstructed it under raking light and infrared scan. It reads, "The key is not to open the door, but to remember where it was." That sentence became the unofficial motto of the archives project that followed. Volunteers inscribed it on their gloves in ballpoint ink, a quiet oath to approach every box as if it contained a threshold. And in the way of all stories that resist burial, hers began to surface again through lectures, documentaries, and whispered genealogies that turned out not to be myth at all. Yet something about her story resists full translation. Even now, historians debate her motives, her lineage, and her voice. Some say she forgave the world that owned her. Others argue she simply outlasted it. Perhaps both are true. The point is not resolution, but echo. If you walk the ridge above the Old North Track today, the pine trees bend toward the river, and in the early evening, the air cools enough that you can almost imagine children's voices drifting from the past. The rise and fall of syllables, the scrape of slate. The ground itself hums faintly with the sound of all that was taught there. That names, once written, outlive ownership. That the quiet work of teaching is the loudest rebellion of all. The reversal began with a single envelope that should not have existed. In 2019, while scanning probate materials for an unrelated project, an archivist named Rix found an entry that referred to letter of confession, sealed and retained by Dr. Hollis, delivered posthumously per codicil. The codicil itself had been assumed lost. The line sat buried in a financial appendix dated 2 days after Thornton's death. Rix requested the physician's estate inventory, and there it was. One sealed envelope marked, "Private for the court," when the world allows truth. The envelope had remained unopened in a medical collection for over a century and a half, misfiled among anatomy sketches. The paper inside was brittle, but intact. The handwriting was unmistakably Thornton's. The letter begins simply, "If you read this, you stand among the ruins of the order that made me." It continues for 6 pages, alternating between confession and testament. Thornton writes of his illness, of hallucinations that were not madness but awakening. He recalls a night when he wandered into the quarters after a storm and saw, by lantern light, the faces of those who had buried a fellow worker. They sang, he wrote, "not for the dead but for the living." The sound carried through me like a nail through wood. I knew then that the ledger I kept was false, that I had tallied souls as if they were grain. He describes the act of rewriting his will as deliberate and lucid. I chose to pay the debt with the only coin I had, land, labor, and name. I gave all to the one who stood nearest the truth. She did not ask, she warned me not to, but I could not die with the books unbalanced. The letter ends with a passage that reads almost prophetically, "They will call me mad, and perhaps they will be right, for sanity in such a world is complicity. But know this, freedom cannot be gifted, only recognized." I saw her, and in seeing her, I saw the measure of my own smallness. Let the ink stand. Rick sat with the letter for hours. The words reconfigured everything. the fever, the scandal, and the whispered coercion. This was no impulsive romance or delusion. It was a deliberate act of moral inversion. Thornton had not lost his reason. He had abandoned it because reason itself had been corrupted by ownership. When the letter was authenticated by forensic analysis, its release triggered renewed debate. Some scholars hailed it as an unprecedented internal critique of slavery written by a participant. Others dismissed it as fabrication or Northern propaganda inserted later. But the ink, the paper fibers, and the seal were consistent with 1857. The final page bore an impression of the hawk and key. The discovery collapsed a century of assumptions about motive and power. What if the real heresy was not love, but conscience? The very word had been absent from the record until now. The letter reintroduced it, and with it came discomfort. Because if conscience was possible inside that system, then silence elsewhere was not ignorance, but choice. Modern historians began re-examining similar wills across the South. A pattern emerged of scattered cases of manumission and property transfer hidden under euphemistic language. To be cared for her benefit, for the education of her issue. Thornton's name appeared in marginal citations, sometimes as precedent, sometimes as warning. It was as if his confession had seeded a secret lexicon among scribes who understood that law could sometimes be turned against itself. In Natchez, the local historical society organized a symposium. Descendants of both the Thornton and Hammond lines attended, joined by archivists, clergy, and teachers. On the opening night, a projected image of the letter filled the courthouse wall, the words magnified and flickering. Silence filled the room as the final line appeared. "Let the ink stand." An elderly woman in the front row whispered. He was asking forgiveness, not for himself, but for the paper. The following day, Ricks presented his findings. He described the physicality of the letter, the feel of it, the scent of old iron ink, the tiny bloodstain near the fold. He explained how Thornton's act anticipated the very moral vocabulary that Reconstruction would later struggle to invent. He ended with a question rather than a conclusion. What does it mean that the only surviving evidence of repentance is a document of ownership? Later that night, as he walked the courthouse grounds, lightning flared over the river. He thought of the first storm that had accompanied the signing, of how each retelling began with thunder. He wrote in his field notes, "Perhaps conscience is a weather pattern. It returns until we learn the sound." Back in Jackson, archivists digitized the confession and released it online. Within hours, it was read tens of thousands of times. Teachers incorporated it into history curricula. Descendants wrote essays about legacy and debt. Yet, even in Revelation, the story is unsettled. It refused to resolve into moral clarity. Thornton had repented, yes, but only after decades of profit. His fortune had been extracted from human suffering. His redemption, however sincere, did not resurrect the lives lost to his own ledgers. In a televised interview, Grace Hammond, Eliza's descendant, was asked if she forgave him. She paused for a long moment before answering, "Forgiveness isn't the right word. Recognition is." The paper finally recognized what the people already knew. That sentence traveled farther than the broadcast itself. It appeared in essays, sermons, and even courtroom debates about reparations. For a moment, the 19th century brushed against the 21st, and the contact left sparks. But as with all rediscoveries, light also drew shadows. Private collectors began offering money for any object bearing the hawk and key seal. Some county archives received anonymous visits from men asking to verify holdings. Security cameras caught nothing but open drawers and misplaced folders. Within a year, at least 3 related documents vanished again, including one ledger referencing Eliza's school fund. Ricks's reports mentioned it only obliquely. History continues to erase itself under watchful eyes. Yet the letter survived because it had already been copied, printed, and multiplied. Its words were too dispersed to destroy. In a sense, Thornton's last act achieved what his life could not: permanence. The ink stood. By the time the project concluded, Ricks wrote a final reflection that reads like an epitaph. Every archive is a mirror. When you stare long enough, it stops reflecting the past and begins revealing your own outline. That outline is what this story leaves us with. Not saints or villains, but people caught between inheritance and atonement. The fever that once burned through one man's body now runs through every record that refuses to die. The question is no longer what he did, but what we do with what remains. When the film of the symposium ends, the last shot lingers on the courthouse seal, cracked and sunlit. The narrator says nothing. Only the sound of distant thunder fills the silence, a reminder that confession, once spoken, never really fades. It just waits for the next storm to carry it forward. The backlash began quietly, as it always does. Within weeks of the confession's publication, polite letters of concern reached the state archive. Inquiries about context, about proper handling of delicate material, and about whether descendants of the Thornton family had been adequately consulted. Then came formal complaints, carefully worded, bearing the weight of money behind the etiquette. A local law firm representing historic interests in the Belmont region claimed the release of the letter risked reputational damage and potential property confusion. In plainer language, they meant that the past had started to act like the present again, claiming space and demanding relevance. The board overseeing the archive called an emergency review. Ricks was instructed to halt all public commentary. The state historian issued a neutral statement. "We acknowledge the complexity of the historical record." It was a sentence designed to smother both fire and oxygen, but the flames had already caught elsewhere. Universities requested the files for research. Activists cited them at rallies. Churches read excerpts aloud during services on repentance. The Thornton confession had become something larger than its parchment. It was no longer a relic. It was evidence. Then, in September, the archive's main server crashed. The digital scans of several manumission cases vanished, including the Thornton dossier. Ricks arrived the next morning to find the building cordoned off for maintenance. When access returned 3 days later, the recovered backup stopped exactly 1 week before the letter's upload. No proof of sabotage, only coincidence, written in the language of plausible deniability. He knew better. He documented everything: timestamps, missing indexes, and anomalous login data, but the administration dismissed his report as a technical malfunction. He was reassigned to inventory duties. A month later, his contract was not renewed. His final memo reads simply, "They do not erase history, they curate amnesia." Outside official channels, the story kept moving. Copies of the confession circulated in classrooms and community centers. Artists painted the hawk and key symbol on murals. A poet in Atlanta wrote a collection titled Ledger of Mercy. A teacher in Natchez staged a play where Thornton's ghost argues with his descendants, each demanding payment in truth. But for every act of remembrance, there was an equal effort to contain. A prominent local businessman funded a heritage foundation whose mission was to preserve the integrity of Southern legacy narratives. Their pamphlets portrayed Thornton as a victim of fevered abolitionist forgery and Eliza as an opportunist. They published glossy brochures with sepia portraits and careful omissions. When journalists questioned their sources, the foundation accused them of moral revisionism. One night, a fire broke out at the small museum that housed Eliza's school bench. The blaze was contained before dawn. Official reports cite faulty wiring, but Ricks, now working independently, noted that the only items damaged were those connected to the Thornton case. The bench survived, though charred along one edge. The museum director said something strange when reporters arrived. "The fire didn't start here," she said. "It started on paper." In the months that followed, whispers turned to intimidation. Anonymous letters slipped under doors. Emails warning researchers to move on. Grants quietly rescinded. Yet the documents kept surfacing in unexpected places. A photocopy mailed to a library in Illinois, a scanned page found on an old genealogy forum, and the transcript of a lecture posted on a student's channel viewed thousands of times. Every deletion seemed to multiply the record. Grace Hammond, now in her 80s, continued to speak publicly. Her calm defied the noise around her. In an interview, she said, "They think silence protects legacy, but silence only protects guilt. My ancestor taught that the alphabet could undo chains. I'm just writing the next line." Her words became a rallying cry. Teachers held reading circles, calling them balance sessions. Each began with the phrase from Thornton's confession, "Let the inkstand be spoken like liturgy." Those gatherings drew scrutiny, sometimes protests. Police cited noise ordinances. Still, they grew. Meanwhile, Ricks's notes found their way online, shared by former colleagues who refused to let his work vanish. Among them was an entry written the night before his dismissal. "The real danger isn't that they destroy the paper. It's that they convince the living that the paper never mattered." By 2021, the Thornton case had become a cultural fault line. Academic conferences are divided over terminology. Should it be called repentance, reparation, or rebellion? Church leaders argued whether the act absolved or indicted faith. Politicians cited it selectively, depending on the audience. In every debate, the same paradox returned. A man's confession used as currency by those he once ruled and resisted by those who inherited his comfort. A filmmaker began production on a documentary titled "To Eliza in Payment." The first scene recreated the signing of the will, candlelight flickering across parchment, thunder building in the distance. Actors recited the lines in whispers, as though afraid to disturb the air. When screened locally, the film drew packed houses and quiet threats. One night, after a showing in Baton Rouge, the director's car was found vandalized, a key scratched into the hood. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The hawk and key had transformed from seal to sigil, from ownership to resistance. It appeared on T-shirts, graffiti, and protest signs. Some called it the Mark of Reckoning. Others called it blasphemy. But it spread because it filled a void, something tangible to represent all that could not be neatly archived. Through it all, the Thornton descendants remained silent. Their lawyers maintained a single statement. The family recognizes the historical importance of these documents and requests privacy. Behind closed doors, genealogists traced the estate's current holdings. Timber rights, mineral leases, and trust funds were noted, and much of the wealth remained precisely where it began. The irony required no commentary. By late 2022, academic pressure forced the state to reopen the inquiry into missing archives. A committee convened, chaired by new leadership, younger and less patient with euphemism. In their preliminary report, one line stands out. Erasure is not neutrality, it is authorship. That sentence, printed on the front page of the Clarion Ledger, marked the beginning of the Second Reckoning. The system that had once hidden the truth was now being documented as part of the story. The gatekeepers had become exhibits in their own archive. And yet, amid all the noise and legal maneuvers, the quiet core of the story remained the same. A dying man trying to balance a book that could not be balanced, a freed woman turning inheritance into instruction, and a modern archivist learning that some ghosts are immune to bureaucracy. Ricks wrote one last letter to Grace Hammond before moving north. In it, he said, "I used to think I was preserving history. Now I understand it was preserving me." She replied weeks later with a line that might as well serve as an epitaph for them both. "The past does not die. It waits for you to admit you belong to it." When you stand in the restored courthouse today, the plaque on the wall bears both names, Thornton and Eliza. No mention of scandal, no mention of property, just the words they left behind. Let the ink stand. And yet, if you listen carefully beneath the hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of tourists, you might hear another sound. The faint rustle of papers that once vanished, now shifting as if breathing. History, stirring in its sleep. Public reckoning rarely arrives with fanfare. It seeps. It accumulates. It moves like groundwater through the seams of institutions that thought themselves watertight, When the second inquiry convened in Jackson in early 2023, the hearing room looked ordinary, with fluorescent lights, folding tables, and microphones blinking red. Yet what unfolded over those 3 days was anything but ordinary. It was the first time in state history that a committee publicly examined not just the content of archives, but the act of their disappearance. On the first morning, they read Rick's dismissed memo into record. Each word landed like a hammer in the stillness. They do not erase history, they curate amnesia. The audience, a mix of students, clergy, and descendants, stayed silent until the chairperson, a woman younger than the century she was correcting, added a single line. "We intend to curate memory instead." Evidence mounted. Server logs, missing metadata, a trail of quiet administrative approvals. Not sabotage, but consent disguised as procedure. A former IT contractor testified that he had been told to clean redundant directories the week of the digital loss. Redundant, he said, had meant uncomfortable. The word drew a low murmur from the room. On the second day, the committee displayed the surviving scans of the Thornton confession and Eliza's ledger side by side. The projection washed the walls with two kinds of handwriting, one slanted and feverish, one small and measured. The effect was cinematic. Reporters would later call it the double exposure of conscience. Scholars dissected the phrasing, the ink density, and the symmetry of their final lines. Thornton, let the ink stand. Eliza, remember where the door was. Two imperatives written decades apart, both aimed at readers they would never meet. Then came testimony from the Hammond family. Grace, frail but sharp, spoke first. "You've spent generations documenting ownership," she said. "Now document accountability." Her words drew quiet applause. Her grandson followed, reading from Eliza's surviving lessons. "To write is to own your breath." Then he looked up. "You erased her breath when you erased her name. Give it back." The committee's findings, released weeks later, read less like bureaucracy and more like confession. Evidence indicates deliberate interference in the preservation of historical documents pertaining to manumission and property transfer. Motive: reputational containment. Effect: public deception. They recommended restitution, not financial, but educational. The state would fund a permanent exhibit titled The Thornton Papers, a case study in silence. The exhibit opened the following spring inside a restored post office, a deliberate choice, a building designed for circulation. Visitors moved through rooms arranged like chapters: the will, the fire, the confession, the erasure, and the return. Each section ended with a single question projected on the wall. Beneath the will, who decides what inheritance means? Beneath the fire, what burns clean and what refuses? Beneath the return, when does discovery become duty? School groups came. Descendants wept quietly before the letters. Tourists photographed the hawk and key seal etched into glass. In the final room, visitors were invited to write one line on a slip of archival paper and drop it into a box labeled Addendum. Within months, the box overflowed. Phrases like, "My grandmother's name was never recorded, and I am still owed a story," filled folders now cataloged as part of the exhibit itself. The archive had turned itself inside out. The public had become the record. But reckoning does not please everyone. Outside the opening, a small protest formed. Signs read, "Stop rewriting history and honor heritage." One man shouted that the confession was a forgery, another that his ancestors were being vilified. They were not silenced, only documented, photographed, logged, and preserved alongside the exhibit's guest book. Their presence became part of the artifact, proof that denial is simply another form of continuity. Inside, a volunteer guide told visitors a story, not in the official program. During renovations, workers had uncovered a scrap of wallpaper from the old courthouse with an image of scales faintly embossed, barely visible. When cleaned, they discovered the scales were uneven. One pan was heavier and carved deeper. "Even the walls remember imbalance," she said. By midsummer, the story had traveled far beyond Mississippi. Academic journals ran special issues on archival ethics. Museums from Boston to New Orleans requested traveling versions of the exhibit. One curator called it the closest thing an exorcism paper can perform. Meanwhile, Ricks, now teaching at a university up north, watched from a distance. He rarely spoke publicly, but in an email to Grace Hammond he wrote, "Every document is a ghost waiting to be believed. I'm glad yours finally found a voice." She replied, "It's not mine anymore. It's everyone's burden." That fall, something unexpected happened. A high school student researching local history found an old tin box buried in her grandmother's yard near the North Tract. Inside, a rusted key, a fragment of parchment, and a coin pressed with the hawk emblem. Experts authenticated the material. The key matched the dimensions of Thornton's original desk lock. The find made headlines as proof that artifacts still surfaced where stories had been suppressed. The discovery reignited interest but also speculation. Conspiracy blogs claimed the confession was part of a hidden order, that more letters existed encoded in church records, and that Eliza had continued her work as part of a clandestine abolitionist network. The noise blurred truth into myth once again. In one sense, it didn't matter. Myths, after all, are simply truths that outgrew their ledgers. A year later, on the anniversary of the exhibit's opening, the committee gathered again. They unveiled a new plaque inscribed with both signatures, Thornton's and Eliza's, side by side, etched onto bronze. Beneath them, one line chosen from the visitor addendum box. "Justice is handwriting that refuses to fade." After the ceremony, the chairwoman spoke to the small crowd. "This is not closure," she said. "Closure is another word for forgetting. This is a continuation." Her statement echoed through the marble hall and out into the street, where rain began to fall in a soft, steady rhythm like pages turning. Some of those present lifted their faces to it. Others hurried away. The camera crews packed up. The courthouse lights flickered off. In the dark, the bronze plaque gleamed faintly under a street lamp. Two names, once separated by law, now reflecting the same light. And somewhere in the damp night air, perhaps only imagined, came the faint sound of a quill scratching across paper. The endless labor of a story still writing itself. Time has a way of sanding the sharp edges off atrocity until all that remains is texture. By the late 2040s, 2 centuries after the will was written, the Thornton affair had become part of the public curriculum, a case study mentioned in documentaries and textbooks under headings like Ethics of Inheritance or Archival Justice. But within the small communities that still bordered the original plantation lands, memory did not flatten so easily. It remained layered, like soil, black over red over clay, each stratum holding what the last refused to absorb. Children in Natchez grew up taking field trips to the exhibit, once known as the Thornton Papers. The building had changed hands 3 times and survived another flood, and yet the hawk and key seal still greeted visitors at the entrance. Guides, often teachers descended from those early freed students, explained how a single act of conscience could ripple through generations, not as redemption, but as a reminder that every document is unfinished until read aloud. The newest section of the exhibit was devoted to echoes, how Eliza's ledger inspired literacy campaigns across the South, how descendants of both families collaborated on scholarships for historical study, and how the same debates that once fractured courtrooms now thread through podcasts and essays about reparations, equity, and remembrance. In glass cases sat photocopies of handwritten visitor addenda from decades earlier. The paper had yellowed, the ink faded to brown, but the words remained visible under low light. One line, written in the uneven scrawl of a child, read, "If she could learn to read, maybe I can learn to forgive." Have I? That line became the title of a modern poetry anthology taught in schools nationwide. Another, "They do not erase history, they curate amnesia," became a rallying slogan for archivists and activists pushing for transparency laws. What began as a whisper between scholars now echoed across disciplines: theology, jurisprudence, and media ethics. The confession had outgrown its paper host. It was alive in language, alive in argument. Still, for every commemoration, there were those who sought revision. A few years after the exhibit's centennial, a group petitioned to remove the bronze plaque, claiming it promoted guilt. Their motion failed, but the debate drew national attention. Television pundits argued about the utility of perpetual reckoning. One historian observed dryly that societies that fear remembering are those still ruled by what memory reveals. Through all this noise, the river near the Old North Tract continued its patient work, widening its bend, erasing and remaking its banks. In drought years, parts of the original foundation stones surfaced from the mud, square blocks streaked with rust, moss creeping through old mortar lines. Visitors sometimes left offerings of flowers, coins, and folded notes. No plaque marked the spot. Only those who had studied the maps knew where the laboratory once stood. On certain nights, volunteers still gathered there for candle vigils. They read passages from the ledger and the confession side by side. One reader would speak Thornton's words of atonement. Another would answer with Eliza's equations. The effect was call and response, repentance balanced by reclamation. The wind through the cypress filled the pauses like breath between lines. In 2057, the bicentennial approached. A commission was formed to produce a new documentary combining all available footage, letters, and testimonies. They interviewed surviving scholars, descendants, and even detractors. The film's title, Balance Remaining, was taken from the margin of Thornton's final ledger entry. Its release reignited interest worldwide. Viewers flooded message boards, debating whether the man had been a hero, a hypocrite, or both. Critics called it a requiem for record-keeping. One scene, simple and unadorned, lingered. A drone shot of the swamp at dawn, mist rising over still water. A voiceover with no name attached whispered, "There are debts you pay by remembering." That line closed the film, and in classrooms and libraries it began to appear on posters beside the Hawk and Key. Meanwhile, another discovery surfaced in an unexpected place. A restoration worker repairing the Natchez courthouse ceiling found a bundle of letters sealed inside a beam. They were mundane correspondences, receipts, and inventories, but among them lay a folded parchment bearing a faint impression of that same hawk. The text inside was brief. "To any who find this truth endures where ink refuses to fade, do not let it fade." No signature. Experts speculated it might have been left by a clerk who copied the confession before its suppression. Others thought it a later tribute. Either way, it confirmed what history had been teaching for 2 centuries, that silence is porous. The letters went on display beside the original confession. Visitors noted how the new find seemed to hum faintly under glass, as though sound itself had soaked into the fibers. Scientists dismissed the phenomenon as vibration from nearby HVAC ducts. Others smiled and said the archives were breathing again. Every generation found its own metaphor. For the 19th, it was justice. For the 20th, equality. For the 21st, transparency. The 22nd seemed to favor witnesses. School children on tours were asked not, "What do you think?" but, "What do you see?" A subtle shift, but profound. Seeing required presence, and presence was the one thing erasure could not counterfeit. And yet, even now, unanswered threads persisted. Somewhere, rumors circulated of another ledger, one kept by Eliza's eldest son during Reconstruction, documenting hidden partnerships, funds sent north, and a network of clandestine schools. No such record has surfaced, but every few years, an amateur historian claims a lead. A trunk discovered in a crawl space, a page found behind plaster. Most prove false. The hunger itself, though, says everything. People still want more. The story, by refusing to finish, continues to summon new tellers. At a commemorative lecture, a young curator addressed the crowd. "When we began, we wanted closure, But closure is a kind of blindness. What we have instead is sight. Sometimes too much, sometimes not enough. Her voice trembled slightly as she gestured to the display cases. These aren't relics, they're mirrors. In that moment, an old woman in the back row stood and asked softly, "And what happens when the mirrors crack?" The curator paused, then said, "Then we see through them." End quote. Outside, rain swept across the street, tapping against the exhibit's windows. The bronze plaque glistened as headlights passed two names, one light. Beyond the glass, the faint reflection of visitors lingered like overlapping ghosts, each silhouette merging with the next. The past and present were indistinguishable for one long, silent moment. Later that night, after the building emptied, a janitor making his rounds found a scrap of paper under a bench. It wasn't official material, just a torn edge of a visitor program with a single line written in pencil. "Let the ink stand." He placed it on the desk by the exit instead of throwing it away. By morning, someone else had added a second line beneath. "And let the reader remember, no curator claimed authorship." The note remains there still, framed in a small glass case near the door. It marks the transition from exhibition to exit, a quiet threshold where those leaving must look once more at the hawk and key seal above the lintel and decide, privately, what part of this story now belongs to them. It begins, as it always did, with silence. Not the silence of absence, but the thick, breathing kind that follows revelation. The pause between truth spoken and truth believed. The old plantation grounds are forest now, pines where cane once grew. The last of the chimneys crumble into wildflowers, the air damp with the scent of iron and rain. Somewhere beneath that overgrown soil lies the cellar where the hawk seal was first pressed into wax, the place where a pen changed direction and history recoiled. No sign marks it. Only the wind, moving through the grass in long exhalations, seems to remember the shape of the house that used to stand there. In 2075, a researcher brought a drone camera over the site. From above, the clearing looked like the outline of an open book, two halves facing the sky. When the footage was slowed, you could see faint lines of stone footings, irrigation channels, and the trace of a foundation. One of those lines intersected a path where a carriage once rolled away under thunderclouds. The archivist who reviewed the image wrote a single note beside the coordinates. The story still makes its own map. Downstream, the river keeps folding new silt over old. Each season, it delivers a different version of the past. Bits of porcelain, rusted nails, and a broken inkwell. Children collect them, not knowing their origin, pocketing fragments of a century that still hums faintly in the dark. The museum catalog calls these unattributed artifacts. But the truth is clearer. They are pieces of debt still paying themselves off. Inside the exhibit, the light has been dimmed to protect the paper. Visitors lean over glass to read the last lines of the confession, lips moving silently. Let the ink stand. Some weep, some simply stare. A docent tells them that the stain beside the signature has been tested. It is not ink at all, but blood diluted by age. Perhaps a nosebleed from fever. Perhaps a punctured finger. No one can say. What matters is that it bound the confession with the body. The ledger closed not with ink, but with life. Across the room, Eliza's ledger sits open to her final page. A child's handwriting, shaky but legible, finishes her last lesson. Freedom is a sentence you must keep writing. Below it, a faint outline of a bird with the same folded wings was drawn generations later beside students' names. The symbolism no longer needs explanation. It has outlived instruction. Every story leaves residue. For this one, it's in the language we use without knowing. Balance, debt, legacy, record, and account. Words borrowed from ledgers, but repurposed for souls. Thornton's fevered conscience gave them new weight. Eliza's steady hand made them human again. Together they built a paradox of sin documented so precisely that redemption became measurable, at least on paper. In 2083, a final addition was made to the museum. A narrow hallway lined with mirrors etched with the phrase, "Remember where the door was." Motion sensors trigger a faint soundscape of turning pages, scratching pens, and distant thunder. At the end of the corridor, one mirror stands unetched, reflecting only the visitor. The exit sign above glows dim amber, shaped like a key. You walk through it, and for a heartbeat the reflection doubles your own face, superimposed on the ghost of parchment light. For a moment, the line between witness and participant disappears. That's how every story like this survives, not by conclusion, but by transfer. The record moves from page to reader, from past to present, from silence to speech. Outside, the air tastes of rain again. The bronze plaque gleams dull gold, water beating along the grooves of each letter. Thornton, Eliza. 2 names, 1 sentence shared across centuries. The rain blurs their separation until only the words remain visible. Let the ink stand. You stand there, and time folds. The thunder rolling in the distance could be 1,857 or tomorrow. The weight you feel is not history pressing down, but history waiting to be carried, spoken, and continued. And that's where we leave this record, not sealed, not resolved, but still breathing. Because stories like this one aren't meant to end, they're meant to remind us to echo. They ask what we will do with what we've learned, whether we will remember where the door was and keep it open. So before you go, take a moment. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact minute on your clock when these words reached you. Time and place matter in stories like this. They are the coordinates where remembrance meets the present. And if you believe these buried histories deserve a voice and that truth, once found, should never fade, subscribe to the channel, stay with us, and help keep the ink standing.